C-226.
Senator McCallum, on debate.
Honourable Senators, I move that this bill be read a third time.
It is moved by the Honourable Senator McCallum, seconded by the Honourable Senator Al-Zaibak, that the bill be read a third time. On debate, Senator McCallum.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Honourable Senators, I rise to begin third reading debate on Bill C-226, an act respecting the development of a national strategy to assess, prevent, and address environmental racism and to advance environmental justice. I thank former MP Lenore Zan, who first introduced an earlier version of this legislation, the former Bill C-230, on February 26, 2020. I thank MP Elizabeth May, the bill sponsor in the other place, for her years of working with grassroots and advocates to lay the groundwork required to introduce this bill. I thank the witnesses who appeared before the committee, as well as the many groups who submitted briefs to the committee. Finally, I thank the senators on the Energy Committee for their engagement, open-mindedness, deliberative discussions, and collegiality as we work our way through this bill. Colleagues, Bill C-226 intentionally does not include the definitions of environmental racism or environmental justice, and this speech will speak to the reasons behind that decision. Bill C-226 is also intentionally not prescriptive in how to undertake the development and execution of the national strategy, as it must be developed in concert with affected individuals and communities. It is critical for people to speak on their own behalf about their first-hand experiences with environmental racism and to be allowed to participate directly in environment and policy-making decisions. As such, it must be their experiences that will inform the framework as they educate and create awareness of how environmental racism developed and continues to develop in their territories. We heard in committee that some people did not know what environmental racism is. This was a very telling statement about the degree of education and awareness that is required to make Canadians better understand this class of racism. With this bill, the affected individuals and communities can share their solutions to inform a strategy that will better equip them in their fight against the racism that has affected them directly. Most simply want basic necessities and things we all take for granted on a daily basis: access to clean and safe water, the right to health, environmental protections, community development, and mitigation of destroyed environments. Honourable Senators, after excellent witness testimony, the committee agreed unanimously that there were to be no amendments to this bill. I would like to note that there was discussion of possibly including reference to UNDRIP in the preamble. However, it must be noted that the bill before us will not only benefit First Nations and Inuit communities who experience this type of racism. Rather, this bill will also help improve the lives of countless African Canadian/Black, Asian, and other racialized communities, as well as women, the 2SLGBTQIA, the disability community, and others who face marginalized and discrimination across Canada. However, under Clause 3, Subsection 2, entitled Consultation, it states that in developing the strategy, the Minister must ensure that it is consistent with the Government of Canada's framework for the recognition and implementation of the rights of Indigenous peoples. Colleagues, I reference Elizabeth May in her witness testimony when she stated that she first became aware of the issues of environmental racism in dealing with Canada's largest toxic waste site, the Sydney Tar Ponds, located in what was the only Black community on Cape Breton Island and in what had been Indigenous fishing grounds in the Moga Creek estuary. That community work for environmental justice was documented in a 1999 film entitled Toxic Partners by Cape Breton filmmaker Neil Livingston. Also, MP May quoted Dr. Ingrid Waldron, who holds the Hope Chair in Peace and Health in the Global Peace and Social Justice Program in the Faculty of Humanities at McMaster University, and other Canadian academics extensively documented the disproportionate proximity and greater exposure of Indigenous, Black, and other racialized communities to polluting industries and other environmentally hazardous activities in Canada. Dr. Waldron, in her presentation at committee, stated, "Since the fall of 2012, I have been examining the ecological, health, political, and social impacts of environmental racism through a community-based collaborative approach that has included research, publications, including a book and journal, water testing projects, community engagement, community consultation, community advocacy, multimedia, including a Netflix documentary and media interviews, mapping using GIS analysis, education through workshops, symposium, and other events, and legislation." She goes on to say, "The strength of Bill C-226 is that it uses an environmental justice lens that not only focuses on industry, waste, contaminants, and pollutants, but also on the historical, societal, socio-political, and economic context within which environmental racism manifests in these communities across Canada. It also clearly identifies the steps that are needed to achieve environmental justice, including research, consultations with impacted communities, the involvement of impacted communities in policy making, and compensation for impacted communities. After 12 years of fighting for environmental justice for these communities, it is rewarding to see Bill C-226 waiting to be voted on at third reading in the Senate. I urge you to pass this bill. Its time has come," close quote. Chief Chris Plain from the Amjiwang First Nation shared with the committee his history of environmental degradation that was developed in his community. He stated, "Amjiwang, now situated in the epicenter of what is referred to as Canada's Chemical Valley, so named because the area contains 40% of Canada's chemical industry. Over the past 100 years, lands and waters in Amjiwang have been impoverished by overexploitation. All facets of Amjiwang's environment are polluted, including the air, the land, and the water. Amjiwang is surrounded on 3 sides by over 60 industrial refineries, the closest of which are literally across the street from important community meeting centers such as the band office, our church, our cemetery, our resource center, and residences. These facilities represent 40% of Canada's chemical refineries. It has been this way for many generations. While settler communities have been relocated at no cost to them, we remain here on our land. To us, it's been an experience of profound environmental racism." Chief Plain also told the committee, "We need to mend the treaty relationship between Amjiwang and the Crown, where Amjiwang has an equal voice in decision-making affecting our lands and waters, and decisions that directly affect our members. We need a seat at the table. and our concerns must inform the path forward. We want to be a part of the solution. We want to feel confident that the air we are breathing isn't slowly killing us. We want to live with peace of mind that our children will not get sick and die before us. We hope that your work on environmental racism marks the beginning of a new, honorable relationship where Amjawang can see measurable results from a government committed to doing better. Honorable Senators, these are very powerful words. Another committee witness, Reuben George from the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, TWN, stated the following in his briefing note to the Energy Committee. In a 10-kilometer stretch of eastern Burrard Inlet, the core territory of the TWN, there is an aggregation of 6 industrial-scale above-ground oil storage facilities and their associated pipeline infrastructure, as well as marine and rail shipping activities. The Parkland Oil Refinery, which produces oil for the lower mainland, is located directly across the water from the TWN community. A flaming tower burns waste gas here 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. West Ridge Marine Terminal, the terminus of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, is also located just across the inlet and is slated to have daily transiting of tankers carrying diluted bitumen starting within the next month. These sites have histories of spills and environmental incidents. These facilities are not situated in the wealthier neighborhoods of West Vancouver or Kitsilano. They are adjacent to our reserve. Mr. George continues, the federal government has committed to reconciliation with First Nations, but TWN has observed federal agency continue to make the decisions, develop legislation, policy, and programs that have disproportionate negative implication for Indigenous peoples. The Trans Mountain Pipeline Expansion Project is an example of this. TWN demonstrated to the Government of Canada and to the Canadian Energy Regulator, National Energy Board, that the project would unjustifiably infringe TWN's Aboriginal title rights and interests with our Indigenous law-based assessment of the project. Disregarding the findings of the assessment, Canada approved the project, prioritizing tenuous economic benefits over impacts to TWN rights and interests. TWN has provided extensive data, evidence, and dialogue to Canada, including the likely extinction of the southern resident killer whales from marine shipping impacts. Colleagues, a further witness before the Energy Committee on Bill C-226, Mr. Les Dysart, spoke in his briefing note about the extensive damage done by Manitoba Hydro to his community of South Indian Lake. This included permanent funding of 837 square kilometers, including raising the level of southern Indian Lake by an average of 3 meters, which is 10 feet. Mr. Dysart also wrote of disastrous flushes of water down the lower Churchill at high water times. These sudden inundations of up to 50% more water than the highest flows recorded in the 15 years prior to the diversion, that these high water times, often during spring breakup, scour the riverbed, batter shorelines, flood cabins, inundate riparian habitat, and temporarily raise levels of lake on the river system by as much as 5.8 meters, 19 feet. Mr. Dysart spoke about the wide-ranging and harrowing impacts that environmental racism from hydroactivity had on his community. The effect on fish and wildlife include the near extinction of a distinct and culturally vital species of sturgeon, a rise in fish mercury to levels not fit for human consumption, the decimation of the most productive inland northern fishery. Southern Indian Lake was home to the third largest lake whitefish fishery in North America. In the decade prior to the diversion, the annual catch averaged about 400,000 kilograms. In the past decade, it was less than a tenth of that. The killing of beaver and muskrat by flooding and unpredictable fluctuations, the disappearance of hundreds of islands due to flooding and erosion on southern Indian Lake, an increase in wood debris from collapsing shorelines getting caught in nets, and half-submerged deadheads create a hazard for boaters. The forced relocation of the community of South Indian Lake and the imposed burning of the old village. When they were removed from their old village, they were only allowed to take a suitcase and that's all they were allowed to take out. The inundation of hundreds of documented culturally significant sites, including graves on southern Indian Lake. In his briefing note, Mr. Dysart writes, "We never wanted the Churchill River diversion. It should not exist. The water should still be free to flow as it was meant to flow. The fish should still be free to spawn where they were meant to spawn. Our beloved homeland should not be sacrificed. But we are demanding that Churchill River diversion, we are not demanding that Churchill River diversion be dismantled, only that damages be addressed and that we have a meaningful say in how the diversion is operated." Honorable Senators, another witness before the Senate Energy Committee, Dr. Sarah Weeb, from the University of Victoria, recommended the enacting of Bill C-226, creating an Office of Environmental Justice that adheres to a collaborative multi-jurisdictional governance model and adopting an intersectional planetary health lens to guide future environmental justice regulatory developments and administrative programming. In her briefing note that she presented to the committee, Dr. Weeb wrote that environmental and human health are inseparable, but they are often treated in silos. An intersectional planetary health lens acknowledges the need to be accountable to human and more than human beings. Following Dr. Waldron, a multi-pronged strategy must unapologetically center race and how it intersects with class, gender, and other societal identities to shape the experiences of communities disproportionately impacted by a web of inequalities and environmentally hazardous industries. Environment policy that acknowledges and addresses structural and environmental determinants of health and culturally relevant participatory democracy approaches. Partnerships between white-led environmental justice organization and Indigenous and African Canadian Black communities, and alliances and solidarities between Indigenous and African Canadian/Black communities. This lens is central to the flourishing of entire ecologies, waterways, plants, animals, and atmosphere alongside human health. Colleagues, these environmental warriors do not give up. There has been and continues to be a mobilization of communities, allies, and activists as they fight against the companies, laws, policies, and other forces that threaten to fragment, displace, assimilate, or drive impacted communities and peoples towards cultural and community disintegration. It is time we join them to support their work towards justice. When looking through the lens of environmental injustice over the 6 years I have been on the Energy Committee, I have heard and seen firsthand some of the Canadian experiences and subsequent claims for justice. Claims that identified how their lives and communities were negatively impacted by the specific type of racism. These claims went beyond environmental inequity or the siting of toxic sites in marginalized communities. These claims were embedded in broader struggles that included institutional racism and oppression, cultural and spiritual genocide, land dispossession, protection from contamination, equal participation, self-determination, ethical and sustainable land use, a healthy community and work environment, food insecurity, upholding of treaties, human rights and civil rights breaches, interjurisdictional gaps, and unsustainable practices of resource extraction. The list goes on. That's why it's very difficult to have a definition of environmental racism when it is so broad. In the article entitled Indigenous Struggles, Environmental Justice, and Community Capabilities, authors David Schlossberg and David Carruthers quote Bunyan Bryant, who offers a definition that incorporates numerous conceptions of justice and illustrates the potential of environmental justice to revitalize and reconstruct functioning communities. In Bryant's formulation, environmental justice, quote, refers to those cultural norms and values, rules, regulations, behaviors, policies, and decisions to support sustainable communities where people can interact with confidence that their environment is safe, nurturing, and productive. Environmental justice is served when people can realize their highest potential without experiencing the isms. Environmental justice is supported by decent paying and safe jobs, quality schools and recreations, decent housing and adequate health care, democratic decision-making and personal empowerment, and communities free from violence, drugs, and poverty. These are communities where both cultural and biological diversity are respected and highly revered, and where distributive justice prevails. Bryant offers a broad integrated notion of environmental justice that goes beyond mere distributional equity. The different affected groups across Canada experience environmental racism in different ways. Hence, their respective definitions will be reflected in the insight and information that will be forthcoming. Honourable Senators, 7 principles of environmental justice were adopted by the self-termed People of Colour at their Leadership Summit held October 24th to 27th in 1991. That's how long people have been fighting in Washington, D.C. In the same article mentioned above, authors Schlossberg and Carruthers quote Dr. Dorchetta Taylor, a professor of environmental justice at Yale. Dr. Taylor had examined these 17 principles of environmental justice and identified 25 different issues for consideration. Included in that, those were protection from contamination and polluting industries, environmental policy based on mutual respect, and demands for equal participation, self-determination, ethical and sustainable land use. Note that equity was only one among many concerns in these attempts to operationalize environmental justice. Colleagues, in the recently released 2024 reports of the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development Report 1, entitled Contaminated Sites in the North, and that was released last week, states, quote, contaminated sites represent significant environmental and human health risks and cost Canadians billions of dollars. Although work was undertaken to remediate contaminated sites, the total financial liability for federal contaminated sites is now over $10 billion. The Federal Contaminated Sites Action Plan did not appropriately support custodians by including climate change and reconciliation with the Indigenous peoples in remediation efforts, which are key priorities related to the management of contaminated sites. The report further states, there are more than 24,000 contaminated sites across Canada. The lack of reporting and meaningful information on contaminated sites, including large abandoned mines, means that the Government of Canada, decision makers, and Canadians do not have a clear picture of the environmental and financial effects of these contaminated sites, close quote. Colleagues, there are many ways that environmental racism manifests itself in very specific sites. The article entitled Environmental Racism and First Nations, a call for socially just public policy development by Christina Dillon and Michael Young states, quote, while the U.S. environmental justice movement has developed at an exponential rate, Canadian efforts have been far less effective, resulting in uneven attention to and action regarding environmental justice. Canadian legislation that deals directly with the inequalities created by environmental injustice is for the most part non-existent. Current public policy regarding environmental justice for First Nations people is needed to ensure equal rights to a safe environment for all Canadians, regardless of race and/or economic status. Failure to commit to such change is tantamount to endorsing the continuance of racist practices, a far cry from the goal of a just society. Honourable Senators, members of the Energy Committee heard firsthand from witnesses their own realities of how environmental racism, because of capital colonialism, has severely disrupted their communities, families, governance, lives, health, self-determination, culture, and so on. That is why social justice for First Nations involves relations-based respect, upholding First Nations law, knowledge system and worldviews, identity and culture, and understanding what colonization did to our people. In T.K. Alfred's book entitled It's All About the Land, he states, quote, removing us from our land has been the project from the beginning, where the native opposes the development of the land for exploitive purposes. That native is defined, out of existence, or pushed out of existence. For us to defer to this notion of Aboriginal and try to structure ourselves and conceptualize our processes and goals accordingly is the end game of colonization. Colleagues, it is time to confront the environmental racism which systematically constructs inequities by conferring advantages upon one group at the expense of others. Power and privilege are distributed unevenly, enabling industry and governments to allow private control of extractive systems where, in the quest for profit and land, certain groups are exposed to known disproportionate risks and effects with no protective or preventive action taken. Today, as extractive industries like oil, mining, hydro, gas, and lumber continue to cause widespread destruction of land, air, and water through unsustainable practices of resource extraction, First Nations communities are needing to work harder to protect and mitigate damage to the land that had been theirs for centuries. As one witness said, as fast as they are mitigating the effects of oil on their waters and their food supply, this same resource companies are damaging other sites already. It is a sustained action of not only taking, but taking without giving back. Taking as if there are no limits to what can be withdrawn, no limits to what brown and black bodies can take, no limits to what a functioning society can take, no limits to what Mother Earth can take. These unsustainable practices serve to deplete our clean waters, negatively impacting our non-human relatives, destroy our life-giving forests, and cause instability of the climate itself. The impact of this reality on human health cannot be overstated. And here we look at premature morbidity and mortality, sexual violence, and the perpetuation of the painful history that brought us to this juncture today. Honorable Senators, we must acknowledge that this type of racism has long been enabled due to a persistent valuing of economy over health and life. In the article entitled "The Environment as Freedom, a Decolonial Reimagining," author Melanie Ranganathan quotes Myron Ebell of the Competitive Enterprise Institute at a gathering of climate change deniers in London in early 2017 as saying, quote, "The environmental movement is, in my view, the greatest threat to freedom and prosperity in the modern world," close quote. The author continues, quote, "Donald Trump, who had earlier recruited Ebell to head his Environmental Protection Agency transition team, echoed this view by declaring in his May 2017 commencement speech, 'I've loosened up the strangling environmental change wrapped around our country and economy. According to the narrative, protecting the environment is freedom robbing. Only by unshackling ourselves from the concerns of the environment can we free ourselves and our society,' close quote. Placing the societal dynamic that enables this reality into perspective, the noted critic of fascism, Theodore Adorno, lamented in mid-20th century Europe that, quote, "People have so manipulated the concept of freedom that it finally boils down to the right of the stronger and richer to take from the weaker and poorer whatever they still have." Honorable Senators, the appetite for change, a change that would be brought about through this bill, is being called for not just within this chamber and its committee. Rather, the groundswell of support externally must also be respected. The David Suzuki Foundation currently has an active petition calling on Senate to pass Bill C-226. This petition has been signed by over 10,000 individuals who are advocating for the improvements that they know this bill will create in the lives of countless Canadians. In a brief submitted to the Energy Committee by the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, CAPE Board member Dr. Ogisto Horn articulates that environmental racism is supported by upstream systemic factors, societal values and beliefs conforming to a capitalist economy, that humans do not have a right to a healthy environment and practice, legislation that does not fairly protect BIPOC and Indigenous communities, institutions whose siloed and competing mandates do not protect these communities and are not uniformly held accountable to the laws already in place, and programs that have been designed without input from all stakeholders. Further, in their briefing note, CAPE also notes that in Akwesasne, on the Ontario, Quebec, and U.S. borders, the people of the Mohawk First Nation are subjected to toxic exposures, including polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, which have been found to be related to thyroid dysfunction, reproductive health harms, cancers, autoimmune diseases, mental health disorders, and more. The exposures are not fixed but change over time as PCBs degenerate and lose chlorine, making them lighter and more volatile. In northern BC, fracking operations are connected to childhood leukemia, cardiovascular diseases, neurological effects, and respiratory illnesses. Fracking also contributes significantly to methane emissions, a potent greenhouse gas, undermining efforts to address climate change. CAPE also notes that exposure of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation to mine-wasted contaminated oil sludge tailings ponds in Alberta and the Imperial Oil Coal Mine toxic tailings ponds leak into the Peace and Athabasca Rivers system has significantly impacted the community's ability to practice inherent and treaty rights, while also leading to physical and mental health issues arising therein. The Native Women's Association of Canada, in their briefing note to the Energy on this bill, state that environmental racism is not new. In Canada, Indigenous communities have fought against colonial law and policies to protect the air, land, water, species, and cultural connections to the land. Environmental racism is a form of systemic racism which is the result of institutional policies and practices. Systemic racism is embedded in the laws, policies, and institutions that govern our lives and has been since European settlers first colonized these lands. NWAC goes on to state, Indigenous women experience gender-specific harms associated with systemic environmental racism. Changes in domestic and familial roles, perceptions of gender and identity, child-rearing and parenting norms, spiritual work, life, work, and social activities impede their right to practice and revitalize their cultural traditions. Disproportionate numbers of Indigenous women experience violence, abuse, loss of culture, traditions and language, unemployment, poverty, lower levels of educational attainment, and reduced access to resources. Colleagues, in the briefing note sent to Energy Committee, the Women's Healthy Environments Network wrote, the notion of environmental racism in Bill C-226 comes from the fact that environmentally hazardous sites, including landfills and polluting industries, are established in areas inhabited by members of an Indigenous, racialized, or other marginalized community. Environmental Justice Robert Doyle Bullard summarizes environmental racism as the disproportionate location and greater exposure of Indigenous and racialized communities to contamination and pollution from polluting industries and other environmentally hazardous activities. The lack of political power these communities have for resisting the placement of industrial polluters in their communities, the implementation of policies that sanction the harmful and, in many cases, life-threatening presence of poisons in these communities, the disproportionate negative impacts of environmental policies that result in differential rates of cleanup of environmental contaminants in these communities, and a history of excluding Indigenous and racialized communities from mainstream environmental groups, decision-making boards, commissions, and regulatory bodies. In closing, Honourable Senators, I want to share some final thoughts. We are here with the bill before us to determine our future as a nation. Our first obligation then is to understand and acknowledge the true story of environmental racism in this country. The history of environmental racism is a little-known dimension of Canadian history. It is not taught in our schools. It is not commemorated anywhere or in our country or the nation's capital. The long history of environmental racism has not been made a part of our national memory. It has been ignored or worse, dismissed. What is known to most Canadians is the present legacy that Indigenous peoples and marginalized peoples in Canada do not have the same standard of life that is enjoyed by mainstream Canada. Canadians easily fall into the trap of blaming people who have been marginalized for the conditions in which they live and for failing to address these problems adequately. That blaming leads inevitably to disrespect. That disrespect, however, also flows from the many generations of public policy founded on the view that people of color were somehow inferior. This long overdue conversation on environmental racism would inquire why, in a land of bounty, we have third world poverty. It is because, quote, there is no real poverty in this country. There is simply excessive greed, close quote. So gently I offer my hand and ask, let me find my talk so I can teach you about me. And that was a quote from Rita Joe in 1988. So I'm appealing to you to listen and to read more about environmental racism. And I want to thank you for listening and taking the time to be here. Thank you.
Senator Platt?
Yes, I'd like to take the adjournment of the debate.
Senator Miville-Dechêne wanted to speak. I was wondering if you would allow her to speak, or if...
No, that's fine.
Senator Miville.
Senator Miville-Dechêne. I'll be fairly brief. I rise to support the third reading of Bill C-226 to assess and prevent environmental racism, sponsored in this chamber by Senator McCallum. This bill has the potential to change things, provided there is the will to do so. Everything will depend on the decision makers in place. C-226 is not a prescriptive text. In Section 3.2, and I quote, "In developing the strategy, the minister must consult or cooperate with any interested persons, bodies, organizations, or communities," end quote. This kind of formula leaves a lot of latitude to the powers that be as to the type of consultation. This is what Madeleine Redford, an inspiring Inuit jurist, explained to us in committee. I quote her, "For a consultation to be relevant, people have to listen, take things on board, and adopt the measures proposed as a result. Too often, in my experience, a consultation boils down to an information session where you thank people politely, tell them you're there and that you're listening, and that you'll still do whatever you intend to do. You just repeat a formula you've learned by heart. It's just a matter of ticking the appropriate boxes," end quote. Further, Furthermore, in Section 3B, or the measures to be taken to assess and prevent environmental racism are suggestions, not obligations. This is the case for compensation for individuals and communities or the participation of local groups in environmental policy making. Why has this bill, then, to develop a strategy, aroused such hope and garnered near unanimous support among the Indigenous groups and experts we heard from? Because, for the first time, the hitherto little-known concept of environmental racism is being named in a piece of legislation. The term is not defined in the bill, likely for cautionary reasons, but it does give a name to what many Indigenous and other racialized minorities have instinctively known for decades. Naming things is the first step to broader awareness. I've always been aware of the presence of factories, polluting refineries, and garbage dumps in poorer neighborhoods, which are unsurprisingly far from affluent residents. For example, there's the mercury poisoning of fish that's preventing Indigenous people from fishing and feeding themselves. But it was only recently that I realized that the residents of Sarnia, Ontario, weren't the only victims of what is known as Canada's chemical valley. The Amjiwanang First Nation, living on the same territory, was literally sacrificed to petrochemicals as early as the 1940s. We're talking about 2,500 human beings, including 900 children. Already vulnerable and marginalized, these families were kept in the dark for decades about accidents, spills, leaks, and fires around the plants. The Indigenous community members were falling ill, and this evidence was considered anecdotal until the community mobilized. Studies have shown the effect of this toxic industrial pollution on rates of miscarriage, childhood asthma, and cancer. Chief Chris Plain explained in committee that his citizens could no longer fish or hunt because of the accumulation of chemicals in the animals and fish. The smell of rotten eggs caused by the pollution was causing dizziness and nausea. This is how Chief Chris Plain defines environmental racism, and I quote, "The deliberate or intentional siting of hazardous waste sites, landfills, incinerators, and polluting industries in communities inhabited by minorities and the poor." In Quebec, a much more recent case made headlines, and some see it as a form of environmental racism due to the slowness of federal and provincial authorities to intervene. In this case, a recycling center located on Mohawk territory, Kanesatake, has no water recovery and treatment system compliant with government standards, despite reminders to build one. Thousands of liters of contaminated water have been illegally leaking into the Lake of Two Mountains since 2016. Moreover, the community is afraid of two illegal sites that are used to sort construction materials. They're illegal. And those are just two examples. Senator Wanda Bernard raised at second reading the case of an open dump that has deprived the Africville district of Nova Scotia of drinking water. These are examples that echo the notes in the preamble to the bill, which names not only Indigenous communities but also racialized or otherwise marginal ones. The scope of this strategy could therefore be extensive. Another example from Quebec, the absence of vegetation and trees in disadvantaged, densely populated neighborhoods would be considered environmental racism. Professor Andréane Parent from Université de Montréal has calculated that less than 4% of the surface area in Montreal North is covered by green space. Importantly, almost half of Montreal North's residents belong to a visible minority, and 1 in 5 has low income. Heat islands, a lack of trees, and few gardens all affect physical and mental health, according to Professor Parent. Inuit jurist Madeleine Redfern and others would have liked to see a few amendments to strengthen the bill. The scope of C-226 is limited, she says, but it's a basis on which to begin documenting the extent of the problem, including by inventorying all Canadian sites where environmental racism exists and the other laws that need to be amended to prevent it. But at this point, the consensus we've heard is to pass this bill as is in order to move forward. I quote Ms. Redfern again. Anyone who says that environmental racism doesn't exist is obviously living in a bubble, a very privileged, very urban, probably very white, middle class and upper middle class bubble. There's no denying it. If you're in that bubble, you're not talking to those who live in rural, remote, or northern areas, or areas inhabited by members of Indigenous communities or minority populations. End quote. In closing, I'd hope then that after there is a certain number of denunciations, there would be more stabilization to preventing environmental racism.
Senator Platt?
Thank you, Speaker, and I apologize to Senator Miville-Dechêne for, I certainly was not my intent to take away her right to speak. Her name wasn't listed on my scroll notes. So at this point, I'll take the adjournment.
The Honourable Senator Platt, seconded by the Honourable Senator Husakos, that further debate be adjourned until the next sitting of the Senate. Is it your pleasure, Honourable Senators, to adopt the motion? Carried. Cardozo?